Welcome back to Tokyo on Fire. You know, the Prime Minister's ratings you might have expected to have taken a hit following the resignation of Fiscal and Economic Reform Minister Akari Amari last week. In fact, his approval ratings have actually increased. It's really an interesting dynamic. Michael, what do you think that's going on in the background?
What's going on in the background? It's what's going on in the foreground. What is going on?
Right.
A scandal with real criminal activity
involving political funds. I mean, it's
the person who's very, very close to the prime minister, who's identified with the prime minister, and the PM comes out shining. The approval ratings in all the polls click up a few percentage points rather than falling.
All polls showed he increased in approval ratings.
And there wasn't like there was some other kind of policy change that was going on that somehow moved things. Who knows what's going on, except possibly people are really, really losing faith in an opposition.
Right.
That the way I see it from the polling is that as we get closer and closer toward the election, the public really expects to see the opposition to step up, see them step up and somehow show some unity, some purpose. And as we get closer and nothing happens, they're going to start abandoning them. And that's what I think we see.
It's the same recipe, isn't it? They see an opportunity to criticize or to lambaste or to shout out in the Diet proceedings, and it's just like a broken record. Can't you come up with something better? And in light of that, you know, I was really pretty impressed with the Prime Minister and also with Mr. Amari's ability to take the heat and to take, you know, all of the questions that were fired at him and answer them, you know, pretty honestly. And he's done an interview since then that he's outlined what happened with the money, what he actually did. I think it was, you know, as scandals go, this one was handled pretty well.
Well, I think that you have to look into the data a little bit in terms of the polling. And that what, at least in the Kyoto poll that I looked at, because that's the one that's carried by my newspaper, what happened in between the months was an increase in the percentage of people who look to Mr. Abe and his cabinet for leadership because there's nobody else.
Okay.
That figure, which has been historically large and in Mr. Abe's favor, that there is nobody else, that there's no other leader that could replace him, that expanded over the last month. So that not only has got the historic high, but it's expanding, it's growing. That there is this sense that he's inevitable, that there is possibly irreplaceable. And at that point, what is the opposition going to do?
Right.
That they have to somehow get to the people, look, he is replaceable. There are alternatives, but they just haven't been able to offer them. Last week, on the 27th of January, they had a press conference at the DPJ headquarters showing their new posters. All three were disastrous. But the most disastrous of all was one that had in the center, I hate the DPJ, but I want to save democracy. And then underneath it says, if you believe this way and you feel this way about us, no problem. Just let us be the opposition for a while. That's your sales point?
I'm tremendously impressed.
Are you ready to vote for these people?
Yes.
Holy cow. I teach a course in politics, and one of the students raised his hand and said, are they allowed to hire professionals?
Right.
You know, are they allowed to hire PR agencies? I said, yes. Wow, that's pathetic.
You know, the Prime Minister has been in office for almost 4 years, a little bit more than 3 years, and his approval rating consistently has been in the 60%, I mean above 50%, except when we were going through the security legislation over the summer. This is pretty unique, isn't it?
Yeah, the security legislation may still always be a source of a downward pressure on his approval ratings. We had yesterday a debate in the Diet, which was initiated by the Policy Research Council head, Inada, who questioned Mr. Abe about his commitment to constitutional reform. And I think they need to stay away from that, because the more that pair talks, and they're very close, in public, that has that it gives an image that these people don't respect any constitution, so don't give them any possibility of reforming it. The Democrats are right. Let's keep Mr. Abe's hands off the Constitution. Let's not vote for him in July.
Sure. Haven't we observed this before on this show, that when the prime minister begins to talk about an issue, people get angry and they begin to sling mud. But when he stays quiet about it, apparently the cabinet approval and the prime minister's approval either stays flat or it takes a couple of ticks up.
That's right. Professor Jeff Kingston calls it the Abe conundrum. I've called it the Abe paradox, where he and his cabinet are more popular than their policies.
Right.
And that when they talk about their policies, their approval rating goes down.
Right.
And the approval for the policies also goes down. So the less you talk, the better you are. This is the bizarre, and that shouldn't happen in the interconnected communication age where we get all these updates about everything. The less communication, the less we know, the happier we are, seemingly, with Mr. Abe.
I think we've moved into a new phase. I think you would agree in Japanese politics. He's finished his international travel. He's come back. He's made a couple of pronouncements. He did the comfort women issue, and now with the change in the cabinet post with Mr. Amari, it looks like we're actually changing gears now, and we could be entering a period just before April that they're going to pass the budget apparently, where they can be called to the mat, and it looks like there might be another scandal or two in the pocket.
Well, that probably was the question of the budget was probably what pushed Mr. Amari to make the decision that he did, because
the deliberations
would come to an absolute standstill. The opposition would boycott, demanding that the budget committee sessions be used only for looking at Mr. Amari's scandal, and that would throw the government off in terms of its timing, and that he would not make the April deadline. Mr. Amari got out of the way. There's nothing standing between the government and now the March 31st cutoff date for getting the new budget done. That being said, we had at the beginning of this week canceled sessions of the budget committee because the opposition still wants to talk about Amari. But with Mr. Amari out of the way, at least there's a chance that the government will make its deadline.
Just a little bit of inside politics, if you don't mind. It might be a little bit boring or too much detail for the viewers, but the budget is now in deliberation. The lower house will pass the budget and pass it up to the upper house. They'll have 30 days to consider it, and that 30 days needs to be 30 days before the 1st of April.
That's right, exactly correct. That's one of the things that has absolutely characterized this particular administration as compared to previous LDP administrations. During the terrible times after Koizumi was prime minister, the LDP-led government would miss its deadlines and would not be able to count the 30 days because under the Constitution, in the case of the budget, once the House of Reps has spoken, the House of Councilors has 30 days to either reject it or to pass it. Even if it rejects it, however, the House of Representatives can vote and it becomes law. That's the only thing, aside from treaties, that's treated that way. All of the legislation requires a different procedure.
And with the coalition, they have the numbers in the lower house if the upper house doesn't agree.
Yeah, they even have override if they have to go to that. But the budget is something that basically once the House of Reps votes for it, it's done. The only thing is that 30 days have to pass before it really is done. So they have the count back. So they want to get things done by March the 2nd, which means they have the month of February, which is a short month.
Right.
And so, things had to happen. Now, it looks like they're going to happen. We're going to be fine. The question is now, how does Mr. Amari's departure and the rise in the popularity and the probability that legislation on TPP will not be the focus of this legislative session, as it was thought it was going to be, how does that fit together in terms of a double election? How Mr. Abe riding high in the polls, the temptation has got to be, let me dissolve the Diet and we go into a double in July.
Okay. Michael, once again, this is a little bit deep perhaps, but there has been talk just recently of an election, not a double election, but closing the House before the upper house election. That would be sometime in the early spring, rather than having a double election, or alternatively having the upper house election as it's scheduled in July, and then the lower house election later in the summer.
That is only because the coalition partner, the Komeito, has said we don't want a double election. And the only reason they're talking about an earlier election, which makes no sense in terms of the cost of running an election, makes no sense in terms of the timing of Mr. Abe's and his LDP allies' hopes for a longer term past the year 2018. All that doesn't work together, but since the Komeito has told them no July double election,
it's either before or after.
They said, okay, well, what about one in April? That's going to, of course, they'll say no to that as well. So I'm still thinking that this, particularly this click upward during a scandal, has got to be a goad to the Prime Minister. Let's go for it.
I completely agree with you, because he is driven to absolutely crush the opposition. And as you said earlier, the opposition just seems to be in such disarray, and it's not able to even cobble together a coherent message in light of, Mr. Amari's resignation.
It's incredibly bizarre. One would think that just because there are single-member districts, that it would all work out in terms of there would be two main centrist conservative parties, like the two-party system of England or the two-party system of the United States, where you have single-member districts. That's not the way it's working out here in Japan. What we have is one major predominant party, and then everybody else is absolutely crushed. And that is actually another of the DPJ's posters, Stop One-Party Dominance.
Mm-hmm. Well, we talked last week about the diminished level of democracy in Japan, as reported by the Economist Group.
Yeah, and they certainly have looked upon the implosion of the opposition as being contrary to good governance. Mm-hmm. Whether that's true or not is hard to say in the Japanese situation. We've never really had much of a two-party system. Certainly under the 1955 system that was established, the LDP was the permanent government party, and the socialists were the permanent small opposition. And that Japan did very well under that system, and the people of Japan became quite wealthy and quite comfortable and quite moderate under that system. It's not such a bad thing. So the judgment of the EIU, the Economist Intelligence Unit, that Japan's democracy has gone downhill because of the continued turmoil in the opposition. Mm-hmm. Who knows whether that's a bad thing or not? And maybe the EIU has made a glaring error.
Right. That's a dynamic mix for an electric environment. You can clearly anticipate that something will happen between now and April 1st, and following April 1st, once again, leading up into the upper house elections. Please stay tuned to these issues. They're very important, and the seeds of change are already sown. Please stay tuned.